Well, hey guys, this is Graham at therecordingrevolution.com. Got an awesome special guest for you today. Producer, mixer Mark Endert. Am I saying your name right, Mark Endert?
That's right, Endert. Yeah.
Endert. Um, this guy has mixed Madonna, Maroon 5, Five for Fighting, Fiona Apple, Train. The list goes on and on. Contestants from American Idol. Pretty much a lot of the things you've been hearing the last 10, 15 years. This guy has either mixed, primarily produced, recorded, or a combination of both. And he's got a little bit of time. He's a fellow Florida guy with us now, and he agreed to spend a little bit of time with me just to answer a couple of our questions on mixing, on how he approaches things. And Mark, just want to thank you for hanging out with us today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So you're in Florida right now, and you're in your own mixing place, your own setup you've got there at your house, basically, right? I mean, you've got the
Yeah,
ideal
basically, yeah. It was my own, personal setup.
the ideal home studio, as it were.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, yeah, that's right. I'm just stupid enough to attempt to put a 9000J. You know, I don't recommend it.
Yeah, it looks a little cramped, but I mean, you got it in there.
Yeah.
Tell us real quick a little bit about how you go from growing up and where you're at musically, what your interests were to now this is what you do full time, and the opportunities you've had to be able to obviously mix and record some super successful music and I think great sounding music.
Oh, well, thanks. I was just a fan of records and even the recording process more than even I was a fan of bands too
Yeah.
and artists, but there was something I was infatuated with the recording process, and I thought there were artists that maybe I didn't even historically, I wasn't historically a fan of in the past, and they would make a cool record, and I would immediately buy it. Now, so the process and albums were really my love. When I was a teenager, and I liked top 40 radio too. We used to have to mow our lawns and wash our cars
Yep.
on Saturday with my dad and whatnot. And top 40 was it sounded a lot different back then. Very UK influenced, actually. A lot of the hits of the 80s, which is when I was a kid, were they just reigned at top 40 radio. So I was just a fan of top 40 and also records, and more than the particular artists. So
So what when you were growing up and you said I really dig this thing, what did you do to get your hands dirty to get into recording? Did you assist? Did you go to school for
yeah,
recording? Like where was your track to get you experienced in that
sure. I was
realm?
a keyboard player, so I had a Jupiter 8, and
Yep.
I had busted my buns actually washing dishes and saved up for Jupiter 8 and Juno 106, and I was a total nerd. I was a idiot. I used to say, like, I had the
Nice.
computers, and like
An idiot.
I had a DX21 was my FM synth at the time. I didn't have enough money for a DX7. Uh, so I started playing, and then what happened is, in the bands that I was in the local bands, they would say, "Well, we need to record some of the stuff that we're doing." So I'd be like, "Yeah, I'll do it because I'm totally, in fact, I'm totally interested in that." So I bought a 4-track, a TAC 2340SX, like reel to reel tape machine, and I just went to town, and we had a little mixer, and I ended up recording all of our stuff. It ended up sounding pretty good.
That's cool.
That transformed into an 80-8 later, which was an 8-track machine. That was like the huge machine when
Yep.
for local recording. We didn't have the technology that is available now for
Yeah.
people that want to stretch their dollar. Those machines were kind of expensive. So, but I was 17 years old when I started really taking day trips down to LA and visiting all the studios. I knew I wanted to be in a major recording studio, and I was blessed enough where I had the opportunity to say, I started in a school of music and decided, I was playing jazz and that kind of thing, and
Yeah.
decided I need to cut to the chase, and I'll go make coffee
Yeah.
for a major recording studio because I want to know how it's done, and that's what I did.
That's
So
cool.
I got my skills to a certain point, and then when I went to go work for the Village Recorder, which was they had SSLs and Neves, all the stuff that I read about in Mix magazine at the time.
Yep.
They had all the, and I knocked on their door and said, I have to work here. I know all the records that were done here, and I just started spouting them off to the the studio manager at the time, her name was Kathy Knopp, and I said, Breakfast in America was done here, and
Yeah.
Studio D Tusk was done here. And I think they were impressed enough just to take my name. They said, we don't have any positions here, but we'll call you if someone gets fired. Long and short of it, 4 days later, they called me.
Nice.
It was before cell phones, so you had to give them your home phone.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, you just were persistent to be able to get access, to get in there, to learn, and to get your hands on it.
Yeah, and that's exactly. And again, that's something that's like we had just discussed maybe before going on this recording. That's something that is less available today than it was. That was
Right.
the only way anyone was making records back in 1989 is when that was. But now things are much more spread out all over the country. There's great recordings happening in every city, not just New York, LA, Nashville, London, which is really what it was when I was starting out. So it is a little different.
So what would you say was your big break? I mean, what was that first record that you got to do, mix/engineer or whatever, that kind of got you a reoccurring gig?
Right. What happened was I was pretty much the chief engineer of Sony. There was a gentleman by the name of Peter Barker who was like the chief engineer, like the tech, who built Sony music studios. He invited me over there and said, "Do you want to be our house engineer, our chief engineer?" And long and short of it is, after a couple of years of doing that, where I did most of the engineering, one client came in and said, well, they didn't bring an engineer. They said, "We heard that you could do it, and here's what we're looking for." And we talked before, and it ended up being the Fiona Apple record, and it was Andrew Slater who was her manager and producer. And Fiona Apple's record was really one where we got to spend time. I didn't get to spend as much time on any other record up until that point.
Got it.
That record took about 6 months, which, long and short of it is, after that, a bunch of, it did sell pretty well. It sold about 8 million records, but long and short of it, as I recorded and mixed all that, and after that, our managers approached me and said, you really should be making records. Like, you should be making records not just for Sony. And so I kind of broke away from Sony and started working all around town in LA.
Got it.
And, I worked hard and was, again, very fortunate. And I never looked back. I never said, I just basically aggressively pursued all the projects that people, wanted me to be a part of. And so I would say that was it, but that was, Was
that the record with Fast As You Can?
It is the first record. It's called Title.
Okay.
It had Shadow Boxer and Criminal. And
okay.
It's 1996.
Hey, man, the 90s were...
I was 24 years old when I was mixing the record.
The 90s were awesome. What's wrong with that?
Yeah.
96 was a good year.
It was 96 that it came out, I think, but it was 95 that we recorded it. So
that's cool.
Yeah.
And then pretty much since then, I know you got to work with Madonna still in the late 90s, so right almost after that. That was pretty much, you just been nonstop since then, right?
Yeah. Thankfully, I had actually mixed. It was the most interesting thing. I mixed the Fiona Apple record in what used to be Madonna's management. So it was Madonna's old studio.
Okay.
Oh God, what was the name of that? It was on 8000 Beverly. It was. I can't think of the name of it at the moment. But long and short of it is, somebody came in, her manager came and said, "Do you know how to record on a 3348? Because Madonna's she's having a little trouble with the people that she wants her vocals done a certain way." And I said, "Sure, I'll record her vocals." Long and short of it is, I ended up recording a bunch of stuff with her, and then it turned into mixing, and it ended up being Ray of Light was that record, which was 1997, and William Orbit was the genius behind that record, by the way. And so when I found out he was involved, I was like, I'd love to be involved, because I figured I could learn a lot from that whole, team. As well as Madonna's an amazing producer. No one, you always see the credit produced by Madonna and you're like, yeah. But she actually
pretty hands-on.
And she knows what she wants. And
that's really cool.
Yeah.
So, I had a couple of questions that I was trying to think of what would be the most helpful for someone of your experience and caliber, because the people that are watching this, they come from so many backgrounds like I was telling you about, but a lot of people are either starting to get recordings that, they don't want to just hide from people that are actually decent or mixes that are actually decent. But as every time you've done a project, I'm sure you've learned, you've grown, you've figured out new things. What's one of those things that you know now, whether it's in mixing or maybe producing or recording, that you wish you knew even before the Fiona record, when you were really starting out, that it only took time to get now?
Right, something that I wish I knew back then. God, there are a lot of things. For me, it's been such an accumulative process. In fact, I still learn stuff today. And even with new plugins, by messing around, I still am learning new things. I guess the thing I wish I knew, because I'm kind of a nerd, and I come from kind of a technical background, and I wish I had maybe broken some rules earlier, knowing that there are no rules for anyone who's sitting in a place and says, "Well, I have a Pro Tools set up. I don't have a console, or I don't have outboard gear." It does not matter. It really does not matter. The gear, I never really get into gear discussions so much, and a lot of people ask me about gear, and I'm like, I love an 1176 and an LA2A, and they all get bored with me because it's the same stuff. The gear really doesn't matter. And pushing yourself to try new things, that is something that when I hear certain records, Bowie records and things, I'm like, you know what? These people were scared of nothing.
Yeah.
They just kept saying there are no rules. Let's just keep going. And that's something that I think anyone can adopt and say, you think records are made a certain way, and maybe I thought that too. I was like, oh, there's a system to making a major label record.
Yeah.
And to anyone out there, and so I thought that kind of going in, and with Fiona Apple, which was one of the first ones, going to 4 mics on the drums and distorting the heck out of it and trying all these new things, I realized, like, oh, there are really no rules. And then for it to be, there was one side where you could say, well, you're arting yourself right out of the business. You're going to go make some art piece that no one will buy. But after it became receptive and you realize, wow, they were really into the product as a whole and the poetry, then I realized, oh, there are no rules to this.
That's
you
cool.
can really, just have freedom.
Fun,
it's art. It is
That's
art.
Really cool. So basically, because when people, like, let's say people that are on my site, in general, on any website or on the web or reading mix magazines, or they're looking for advice, I mean, they're going to see tips or opinions that, we did drums this way, we used 4 mics, we used 30 mics, we used these types of pre's, and they'll see things and maybe jump on, okay, that's the way I have to do it, perhaps, and get caught into a trap of, that's the way this record was made.
Yes.
And that was a super successful record, and so they try to do that. And you're saying, don't be afraid to just try anything, because you might stumble upon something that sounds great or is unique or is fresh.
Yeah, and it's so true. I just recorded a singer, female, and I have a fantastic compressor. It's custom made. Steve Furlot made it for me, and it sounds amazing. Blah blah blah. We went to the studio, and at the studio they had a compressor that was just, it was awful looking. It was awful sound. I ran something through it because it looked interesting, and it was so distorted. It was so out of calibration, so distorted. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like that maybe is cool for guitar. As long and short of it is, I tried it with the vocal, and for some reason, I don't know if it was her headphones, I don't know, she would sing better through that compressor than my big $5,000 one. And I brought it to LA. I lugged this thing on the plane, the whole deal, and I'm thinking I got so much invested in this stupid compressor, including lugging it through the airport. And she sang better through the piece of crap. And that's all. For me, it's about capturing that emotion.
Right.
So that thing that was wrong, and it's distorting when she hits hard a little bit, it had the right vibe, and it's like, and she was feeling the right vibe with it, which cool. Basically trumps everything else.
Oh, yeah.
It trumps everything. So the moment that I found that she was singing better on something, I was like, there it is. I mute that, we did all the vocals to that compressor.
So it actually affected her performance, not just sound quality, performance.
Yeah, that was one of the few times where I thought, wow, she's really getting immediate feedback.
Wow.
And the feedback in the sense of she's able to play off the distortion,
right.
Play off the warmth, and whatever she was hearing in her headphones affected her performance. And so that, for me, is the one that decides everything.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so any of your users that feel like, well, I don't have like some of the fancy stuff that I read about, it really doesn't matter. And
Yeah.
I truly mean that. These plugins are amazing today. There's plugins that I have here that I have a really good LA2A, like a really good one. And there's plugins in here that sound just as good. And mine, I'm afraid, could hit a sweet spot and then start going south over the next 4 or 5 years, and this one will stay in the sweet spot. The the
Right.
the, the digital one,
Right. It's
so
crazy. Yeah, it's crazy.
so anyone who feels like, well, I don't have it, they do. I mean, it's getting now where it's financially, it's not, it's affordable to get
Yeah.
great sounding stuff.
Well, and you're right, and that's what my site's all about. Is that we are living in this revolution of the barrier for entry to get into what you're doing has just come down by price because of technology. So that's less of an excuse than it was perhaps in the past. So
Yeah,
now it really is just down to skill and experience.
yeah,
Like that. If you're not getting good recordings, you need to work on your own abilities and not just blame it on the gear. So that leads me to another question. So obviously you've got experience now with mixing. If someone sends you a mix right now, let's say Maroon 5 sends you a mix and they're saying this is going to be the next single or whatever, like, can you mix it? When you throw up the faders or you've got the tracks in Pro Tools set up, like, how do you start? How do you personally like to start mixing? Some people love starting with the vocal, if that's the thing, or some people
yeah.
have to start at the bottom, drums, bass, and work up. How's your workflow start for you?
Yeah, my workflow starts by trying to figure out what makes the song tick, and I always figure there's only going to be two or three elements that really are the crux of the song, that really are the fundamental element of the song. And often that is the vocal, the drums, and the bass. And I kind of break it down to, but I start looking through tracks to find out what makes it tick, and I kind of jam levels around a little bit. Um, Sometimes a percussion element can be playing a rhythm, like a counter rhythm, that you're like, wow, that's really what makes the chorus jump out. It's not just a straight percussion. It's something that's maybe anticipated or something. You're like, oh, it's that little upbeat thing that makes my head go up and down in the middle of the chorus. So
Yeah.
I do try and find what makes it tick. And sometimes that can be a guitar, that's a little like tink, 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 and you're like,
Yeah.
wow, that is really important for
Yeah.
the chorus to open up. I break it down to the fundamental things. For me, it's often bass, vocal, and I search for those little things. I don't really start like with the kick drum or any, like
Yeah.
like whatever. Yeah,
I mean, that's why I ask, because some people, they have to work that way. They always start with the kick drum. But
yeah,
I mean, that's
yeah.
where I'm getting at, is that you can approach it differently. I'm curious as to how you
It's true.
start.
And approaching it from the kick drum was like, okay, well, let's do a systematic, logical sweep through all the elements of the
Sure.
mix, so to speak. But if you're looking at it from a creative standpoint, which is really, what music is you're looking at it from the emotion or
Right.
the feel, because that's all we're really selling with music is the feel and the emotion. Then the way I work anyway is I work with trying to find out what are the elements that make up that feel. The rest doesn't matter, and then it's like, okay, I do know at some point I got to get to the kick drum because I
Yeah.
want it to sound punchy under the bass. But if the bass is doing something interesting, I'm going to want to favor that
That
over.
makes sense.
Yeah, so it's a different approach.
So, like, with something, and I'll keep coming back to Maroon 5 just because I clearly have a personal liking to that music. So, I mean, and those of you that are watching, like, Mark, you've done so many different types of music that there's a lot for you to like. But, like, that, or even Gavin DeGraw, because when I was talking to you about our buddy Ross Copperman, I always called him, like, the next Gavin DeGraw, or, like, the Coldplay Gavin DeGraw. He had that feel, but with the tightness, like the poppiness, with also the rock feel, and then with like Maroon 5, a lot of like real vintagey synth type sounds, like a real like soul rock thing. Like, you have so many layers of sounds, it seems like. How do you approach keeping that so tight and clear? So on the radio I can still hear it, I can still jam along with the song, but there's a lot going on. There's probably live drums and sample like loops
Yeah,
behind it and all that kind of stuff.
yeah. It's funny because there were live drums. There were most of the like "Makes Me Wonder" was a track where most of it was mocked up here, where I did most of the pre-production here. I had I think I had a temp vocal to kind of work with to program around, and then I mocked up most of the parts actually in Logic more than Pro Tools. Um, and then we went and the band replayed, so it would sound like, like Maroon 5, and they actually would add their creativity to it, which was phenomenal. With a lot of that, you do have to be careful about cluttering the track. There's that fine line of, we were kind of crafting that to sound like some older records. I was listening to Michael Jackson. I was referencing older records, R&B records. At the same time, we wanted it to be a bridge to a new sound. They were kind of a neo soul band with songs about Jane.
Yeah.
And for the second record, it was like, how can we bridge a newer sound, more modern sound that has just a more modern pop flavor, like Top 40 Radio does today. And so it was a fine line, and some of that is very thoughtfulness. Some of it too was, I remember tightening the programming to Matt Flynn's drums, like really dead on, and a bunch of vibe went away. Like when it was dead on, everything lined up, a bunch of vibe went away. Huh. And so I remember moving the programming off by, 25 milliseconds, something like that, to actually make it flam. And it started to get the vibe again, like back to where it wasn't tight.
Got it. So the programming drums being slightly off from his live drums, you mean, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like I had programmed drums. He played to him. He's not going to play, totally in phase.
Sure.
So he did his take. I thought, God, it has a vibe. We worked with that for like a couple of, like a week. We did all our overdubs of that. I never bothered tightening the drums. I finally said, let's tighten the programming now to Matt after we had it feeling great. And we did that. Vibe went away. And so I was like, you know what, let's offset the drums now to kind of screw it up again. Yeah. Like flam it the whole way. And it flams the whole way, and it feels so good.
That's
flamming. Cool. So there's those little things that I'd like to say there's some magic combination, but often in music there's not. It ends up being, kind of, sometimes you paint yourself into a corner and go, you know what, it was better when we were over there. And
so you're saying it's almost being willing to notice that you screwed it up in the mix and go back to where you had it.
Totally, and recognizing that is probably it's a very important thing to know when you. It's actually very important to know when you have something that is good. Yeah. A lot of people also second guess.
Sure.
Hey, do we like this? Do you like that? And it's good to get other opinions. But there is something very important about having the confidence to say, you know what, that is great. And often I've battled artists where they're like, no, I want to do it again. Huh. Really talented people who could probably do it again. But knowing when it's good, too, is also important. To say, you know what, I'm confident with this feel, and this is we've captured the emotion, and let's not try and reinvent the wheel.
So take that to the mixing phase. When you're mixing, whether there's an artist with you or, like you were telling me earlier, most of the time now you're just mixing by yourself and they can reference tracks. How do you know when a mix is done? Like, how do you know when you're really only going to screw it up more if you keep dabbling with it and it's time to just print it and have a listen?
Yeah, that happens more often than I'd like to admit. That, like, we'll get it to a point and then I send it off. I always call the first pass. I either call it like listen, mix, or reference or something like that. And there's a point for me where I'm pretty meticulous. I'm kind of a tweak head. And I'll go through each section to make sure that there's contour. Make sure that each section is, what in my opinion has an attitude the best that it can be, and also giving contour. Sometimes you don't want everything in. They'll say, we had more guitars than that for the bridge. And you're like, yeah, but the bridge really needs to open up. You got a ton of guitars in the chorus, so I muted two of them, or I brought two of them down. Sometimes we don't use everything to get the contour, but I try and get a good flow and just, hopefully take you on a journey, add new things into the second verse. I'm a channel changer, so if something new doesn't come in second verse, I'm bored on the radio.
Yeah.
And so we do all that. There are times when it gets tweaked where you're like, let's go back to one of the first passes. And thankfully, those have made it on more records for me. Luckily, than I would ever admit. That the first passes are very important. And they're very important.
I mean, that being said, interesting question. Like regarding workflow with that, how do you personally if you're mixing, do you print like a digital like WAV file to keep a reference of things in case you ever want to go back? Like how do you keep your file management system there?
No, you're totally right. I absolutely do with Pro Tools. Well, with the SSL, of course, you can store a recall.
Right.
You can store a recall with Pro Tools. Anyone who has something good going and they have a Pro Tools mix going, it's save session as you say. You title it like I'll title things. Whatever I give the client, I'll title that in the Pro Tools. So they said, we really like your listen mix or whatever. I have as much stored in there, and we also store the listen. We call it the same thing on the SSL. So I do keep references. Back in the day, I used to, when the client was coming and they said, hey, we're about half hour from coming down the studio, I would always turn to the assistant and go, okay, let's hit the 2-track before they walk in that door. I'm going to want to take a copy of this. Because we didn't have undo.
Yeah.
You had to. So basically, and on an Eve 8078, which is like Fiona Apple or something, or Gavin. No, Gavin I mixed on an SSL. That's right. So long and short of it is, we would take a 2-track before they ever walked in, and just to know, just in my heart, I could know, okay, if everything goes south here,
We've still
I
got
got something.
that version. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So if in the digital world, if someone's just using DAW only, you would say then you do a mix, you're doing a reference for your client or somebody, but if you're going back to do tweaks, don't tweak it on that same session, save session as,
Yeah.
so you could always go back to the original session.
Absolutely, and I absolutely love that, and that's true with the plugins as well. Sometimes you can have a vocal compressor, like in Pro Tools. I'm sure people do this all the time. I just option drag one down to the next processing slot is what it is, but I disable the first plugin. You can try 3 and 4 settings
That's
for a
smart.
vocal and have never lost your other settings, and then you can say, the LA2A is beating out
That's a great idea.
the LA3 or whatever,
Yeah.
or the LA3 has a vibe. And I love that about plugins and Pro Tools and Logic and
I never even
saving
really
sessions.
thought. I
You
never
can
really
go
thought
down a
about that.
whole road and say, I'm going to take this to a totally different place over the next 2 hours. And the fact that you can A/B is just awesome.
That's a good
It's
point.
awesome.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And also today, we had to somebody liked something from my initial pass. They had resung some vocals for a bridge. The best thing about Pro Tools too, if you've saved that session, you can import those tracks, just the elements that have changed. If they say, hey, go back to the thing you had on the listen mix, I just import those selective tracks, and now they still have their new vocals at the end and all that. But I've got the old settings on the
That makes sense.
on the other elements. So those are lifesavers now.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So in terms of mixing, this is one of my other questions. Along with what you wish you had known back when you started, now if you're mixing a record, what are some of the glaring mistakes in terms of the mixing process that you knew you were making 15, 20 years ago that, maybe you don't want to admit some of them, but the things that once you learned it, you're like, oh, like why was I ever doing it that way? Or I would have saved myself so much time and hassle if I just I don't know, flip the phase button or whatever it was, that type of thing.
There have been a number of things that I've learned that I was like, wow, I used to spend a decent amount of time like on the drum kit getting it to sound a certain way, and ultimately, your levels are like your first EQ actually. So it depends on what the level is going to be of that element in the mix. Really decides how you're going to EQ it. And I know that sounds funny, but I didn't know that when when you first started out. I didn't have a ton of mentors. I had to figure things out for myself as well. So I'd start making a drum kit sound great. Well, it depends what levels things are.
Sure.
You can actually add a bunch of mid-range to a guitar, and so that it has a ton of bite, and you may not need it. You may go, well, the level I want these guitars is super loud, so I don't actually need all that extra mid range.
Yeah.
If you're like, what, these guitars they're kind of not as important. You might need mid range to because you say I'm going to keep them so low that I really just want to hear fundamentally what they are, as opposed to all of the full spectrum of them. And I didn't know, like, levels kind of like your first EQ, and if people keep that in mind, it already starts steering you to the mix early on. Whereas I used to start messing with the kick drum and the hi-hat and all that, and they're really, until you find out how it ticks in the actual mix, it's almost not worth spending as much time on until you get to that point.
That makes sense. And then when you mix now, at this point, do you set a time limit for yourself as like a goal? Like ideally, with this type of client, this type of mix, I should be able to do a mix in whatever time that is, or do you just literally mix until it's ready and it varies from song to song?
Yeah, it does vary. I'd like to. I've had to set time limits for myself because I am kind of a tweak head, and there have been clients too where I'll call them in the mornings and I'll say, guys, I'll do what I call an end of night reference. So I'll work all day, and at the end of the night, I'll want to go home and say, let's check out what I did yesterday. And there have been times where I've called the client and says, guys, I've printed a mix last night. If you want to hear it, I can play it for you. I'd love to get in there and give me 3 more hours. Let me tweak some things, and I'd feel much better. And 90% of the time, actually 99% of the time, they're always cool with that. They're like, the dude's into it. What do we want to, he's into what he's doing. Let's just give him the extra 3 hours, whatever. And, but yeah, I sadly spend, I spend like about 16 hours on a mix, I would say. I give it a good 12 hours during the day, and then I'll always tweak the next day for maybe 3-4 hours. Yeah. So, but the track counts are so high these days. Yeah. Most of our tracks are 150, 140 tracks. We just did 165, just a few days ago.
What a mess, man. I mean, honestly, like if you get a session like that you didn't engineer and you're getting 165 tracks,
yeah.
Do you just feel like you have the permission to literally, without anyone knowing, just start either busting things down or cutting tracks out that honestly are just, we tracked 13 mics on the snare drum because we didn't know which mic we wanted or something?
That's exactly what we do. We get kick in, kick out, kick sub, and for me, what I do is I immediately take those tracks. Okay, I know what I want those to sound like, and I make a kick drum track. One track, I do it. I have analog VU meters here, so I end up busting it at a level that's for a normal tape machine. Same snare. We get snare top, snare bottom, snare side. Sometimes there's an alternate snare. I end up making one snare track.
Okay.
We get the rooms. We get drum kits that are 28 tracks, 30 tracks for a drum kit.
Oh.
When I was producing, a drum kit was never more than 10 tracks. It was always 10 tracks was the max. Most of the time less. So I make stereo, we'll get separate rides, we'll get 2 sets of overheads often,
wow. And
I make 1 set of overheads and rides, and I bust all that stuff, because ultimately, and there's a lot of mixers, by the way, who their assistant, the person who's helping them, does all that for them, because they don't even want to know about it. I still do it myself, sadly, where I'm like the guy, because I do feel like, okay, the reason they left it separated is they wanted me to make some decisions.
Now, if you're recording the project, let's say Gavin DeGraw's like, hey, I want you to come engineer my project too. How do you like to work? Do you like to give yourself more options, or does that just slow you down at the end? You just make a decision on the floor?
Yeah, I make those decisions right then and there, and I feel like if you approach it, often for me it was always like, well, I know I'm going to have to mix this,
right?
At the end, especially when I was a producer, so to not leave even myself a bunch of work, I would commit then. And actually, I always believe that the mix starts the moment you're putting up the mics. I mean, really, it truly is how it works. If those selections, the mic selections that you're making, those kind of things, really are defining the mix at that point, which is really how it should be. As a producer, you should say, hey, maybe I want to use PZMs because they're not as bright or full, because I'm going for a different thing. That is already normally an EQ that in order to get that sound, you'd have to start EQing. If someone gave you M49s, which are full and warm, and they're like, yeah, make those make those room mics sound like PZMs, you're going to have to do EQing and stuff. Right. So I think those selections I've printed effects. I print effects because there's some delays that I get going that I'm like, I don't know if I'm ever going to get this back like in this way, and it feels really good. Yeah. And if you ever capture a feel that you like, I say just print it. Right. Especially with guys who are working in digital audio workstations, and there's some stuff in Logic where you're like, wow, these delays are kicking. Print it and give it, print it, because if you do want to hand it over to another mixer or someone else to work on it, they may not have the same plugins, or they may say, I don't have Logic, or something, or I have Echo Boy, I can kind of simulate it and But I say if something's working, print it.
Right, because you're saying even something like a delay. I mean, that was affecting the performance and the feel at that moment, so it should all be
Oh yeah.
there.
And all the absolutely and all and you'll end, from a production side you end up finding that people play differently. You can put a delay on someone's vocal, and if they're singing with it on, it can affect the way they sing, and it can be good or bad.
Yeah,
But if you find the right one where you're like, dude, I'm gonna put a slap on, and you're gonna start sounding like John Lennon in your headphones,
yeah,
you'll find they'll start singing and they'll
yeah.
start shortening those phrases. They
Hmm.
start shortening the ends of those phrases because they want to hear the slap, and it ends up giving the attitude. And you're like, you know what? I've always tracked dry, and I've never sung that way. There's some things that I say commit to those decisions. Commit as early as possible.
That's really cool. That's great advice, man. Especially for us guys in this new wave of digital was the only thing we were ever experienced with. So, like you said, undo has always been there. 32 tracks was a limitation.
Yeah.
Why do we have only 32 tracks in Pro Tools LE? This is ridiculous. I should have 150 on my laptop. But that's the world a lot of us have grown up with, and so we want more and more and more, but it actually maybe can slow us down where we're not actually committing to anything ever.
Oh yeah. And there have been some fantastic recordings that I used to have to make safeties of multi-tracks. Whenever you sent a multi-track, like a actual 2-inch tape,
Yeah.
to on a plane, like back to England or something, we would have to make safeties at the studio. Um, Tears for Fears, Madonna Like a Virgin. I got to hear all these multi-tracks because when they got shipped, they stored them in the tape library like the Village. And you'd be amazed. Back then, when real estate was limited, actually 48 tracks was like the huge thing. When you linked 24 tracks, that was like Mondo. You were like big time. And two of those tracks were for time code. Often two of those tracks were left for the space track between time code. So you were really down to 44 tracks. And you'd be amazed at how much stuff was printed. I mean, I'm sure if you opened many records, you'd be shocked at how many, because people didn't have the unlimited DSP that we have now, or they didn't have unlimited outboard. Some of these studios would be like, all right, free up the 480L, like let's print that because we need the 480L
Right.
to go over here, and
Right. Like you're right. Like if you got a Fairchild plug-in, you can put that one plug-in on every single track or multiple instances of it. But if you have an actual Fairchild, you can't. You've got
It's so
one.
true. They used to get the piano, like let's say the piano's going through, they would say print it through the Fairchild. Let's go free it up for the vocal now.
Makes sense.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
Yeah, that's the records that we grew up
But it
with.
sounds crazy to people, in my generation, like, wow, how could you ever, what if you don't like it later,
Yeah.
It's like, well, maybe
It's-
that's a good thing, because you might change your mind, and it was good at the time, so stick with it.
It's true.
That's really
It's
cool.
true.
So, Mark, I know I want to wrap it up and taking up your time, but I was curious, what are you working on next? Is there anything you can talk about that you're working on currently that you're excited about, or a new project or something?
Well, we are working particularly just right now. We're in the middle of a band called Need to Breathe, which is actually
Yeah,
they're
I
on
love
their
those guys.
third record, and these guys are like legit, like they're actually legitimate artists, and I kind of think it's their time. There's been kind of I have hats off to Glassnote with Mumford and Sons, and of course Kings of Leon and those kind of bands. I'm so excited that they've been so successful in the past couple of years because it has opened up more doors. Need to Breathe is one of those bands that's actually been around a bit.
Yeah, they do Washed by the Water, right? Is that one of their tracks? Yeah.
And they have some diehard fans, and they sell more records every record, which a lot of artists are going the opposite direction. These guys are actually selling a bit more records every record, and they have some very, very cool songs.
That's cool.
And Bear's voice, he's the lead singer, is unbelievable. So every day it's not pop music in here this week. It's actually very cool and very vibey. And
that's awesome that you get to work on that, man. I'm stoked. When is that supposed to roll out, do you think? Later this year?
I'm not sure. I think they're shooting for summer.
Okay.
Summer release. So
that's really cool.
it's cool. It's cool.
That's exciting. Well, Mark, I appreciate the time, man. I know people watching this, reading this, appreciate it, and we're just glad to have you on and appreciate your your thoughts, your advice, and best of luck with your entire career, man.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, and I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
It's been great, man. Appreciate it, Mark.
Thank you.